Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Fourth Industrial Revolution podcast. I have my regular guests and co-hosts, Olga Topchaya and Dylan from Dylan Curious AI. In case you're new, I'll just do a really brief introduction, but I think most people are probably getting situated now. Olga is the founder of Lapis Consulting, so she started in the prompt engineering space and has since pivoted to the entrepreneur space and does small and medium business consulting, onboarding, and integrating artificial intelligence, namely generative AI. And then Dylan is a fellow YouTuber and creator in my same space. Great guy, super sharp, and I always enjoy talking to these folks. So, guys, thanks for jumping in, and looking forward to the episode.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, likewise.
Excellent. So we wanted to just tee it off with a couple of ideas. And also, I do want to address sometimes there's some latency. So if we end up talking over each other, it's not that there's too many cooks in the kitchen. It's just that there's sometimes some internet latency. So the first topic of the day is the California Senate Bill 1047. So, Olga, do you want to lead us off on that? Because I hadn't heard about it, but you brought it to our attention.
Sure. So I think this was just yesterday that it got passed. There's going to be a lot of more strict reporting requirements. I think it's specifically for California, but obviously it's going to apply everywhere that OpenAI is used. And it's mostly requirements. There's going to be a division that's created. I believe it's called the Frontier Artificial Intelligence Division that's going to help with the oversight. So it'll apply to models that are just really large models. I think it's something like 10 to the 26th power parameters that they're looking at, or data points that they're looking at. And then, so like the smaller open source models are likely not going to be applied just yet. And it's also for people who are operating computer clusters of, I believe, it was 100 gigabits per second. So those people are also going to be subject to harsher reporting requirements, although not as strict as the large LLM requirements. I think that's it for the most part. Those are like the big takeaways. They're concerned about safety. They're like one interesting thing I also saw was like autonomous model behavior that is like counter to what a person expected without a prompt will be considered a safety incident. So I'm not sure if that will necessarily apply to agents because those are prompted. It seems like it's just like a model goes haywire without like anyone knowing anything about it. That might be a safety incident. So I think we'll begin to kind of see how it plays out and what really gets deemed as falling under the requirement. Does not mean they're going to be illegal, or it just means that there's going to be strong requirements.
Yeah, glancing over it because unfortunately I didn't catch this news. But glancing over it just before we started recording, it does seem like there's a few kind of popular things that have been tossed around. So like that, the model kind of threshold is the ones that require 10 to the 26 power floating point operations to train, which I think is I don't recall, but that's several orders of magnitude above anything that's been trained today. And that seems kind of like an arbitrary number. And as far as I know, no one has talked about the science behind why that number was picked. I don't know if either you guys have any insight into where that number came from. But this is certainly not the only piece of legislation, because there was that think tank, the RAAI think tank, that proposed something similar that was a little bit more draconian. But yeah, and so it's taking a step back. It's not entirely surprising because California tends to be a little bit more proactive in legislation, a little bit more like Europe in terms of the way that it faces regulation. And as the most populous state in the nation, it is kind of a world unto itself. I don't know, Dylan, what do you think about the any of the criteria of this or the direction of regulations?
Yeah, I don't. First off, I just was going to say, like, in case anybody's wondering about my eye, I had a blood vessel break in it, so just forgive me. It's like a bruise; it'll go away in a couple of weeks, and it doesn't bother me at all. But I think that the capabilities are surprisingly more important than model size or training runs, and we're not always aware of even what those capabilities are until they're open sourced sometimes, and enough people have played, or at least they've played with them. Not always open source, but at least the models are able to be ran through some APIs. And I would love internally if people had some requirements to talk about model capabilities more so than some of the other metrics. And I don't know. I mean, I'm maybe a little bit opposed to some people. I'm kind of into regulation in some ways. I like the idea of starting to establish something where something beyond borders maybe could catch on, where people around the world start reporting in some kind of centralized system so people can actually do some measurements on it. So I feel like it's kind of okay for California to do that. And if they fall behind a little bit, so be it. In the long run, maybe that structure is something we can build off of.
Yeah. Taking a look at some of the list of the requirements that this regulation proposes or actually implements is let's see, they're required to do capability testing post training to ensure that the models do not have hazardous capabilities such as enabling the creation of WMD, so weapons of mass destruction, or causing catastrophic cyber attacks. So it seems like they have identified a few capabilities, like known
Hmm.
capabilities, but I guess part of what you're talking about is emergent capabilities, like things that we're not really sure what the model will be able to do. And then Olga, you mentioned either autonomous behaviors as well. Like
Yeah,
basically, it sounds like the regulation says it must be steerable. So what do you guys like?
exactly.
I think that's kind of like two sides of the same coin. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So this is what started making me think about agents, specifically things I don't know exactly where it stands, but things like baby AGI or didn't do check-ins with you on, like what it is that you want to do. You just gave it like one prompt and then it went off and just did I don't know what. Back then when I tried it, it was like very rudimentary, so it didn't really yield anything beyond a hallucination. But I don't know how that is going to evolve. Then you have something like, I think, Agent GPT, where they will check with you periodically on, hey, do you want, like, this is what I'm going to do? And do you want me to do this and go a step further? So I think stuff like that is fine, but just like giving a model one prompt and letting it go off and do whatever is likely going to fall under like either strict requirements or just be considered like a safety incident altogether.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, because and that was so to put a little bit more context. Some of the earliest, like there was Chaos GPT and Baby AGI, and some of those that were attempted right when I think it was when the Chat GPT API was made available, and so people are like,
Mhm.
oh hey, let's experiment with autonomy. And we very quickly learned out in the the software architecture and agent space that there needs to be a feedback loop between the user and the agent. And then actually, when I interviewed the architect, the lead researcher at Microsoft, Dr. Chi Wang of AutoGen, what they actually started doing was creating a user proxy. So they actually created an agent to act as your representative for the agent swarm, so rather than waiting for user input or interface, it could just ask the agent, hey, what does the user want, what is in the user's best interest here. So I'm one thing that I'm
Yeah.
curious about, and a lot of people are and I'm not hardline on any one way or another on regulation. I know some people are vehemently against it and some people are for it and so on and so forth, but one of the concerns that I have, particularly of trying to legislate machine autonomy, is one, unintended consequences, meaning like, okay, well, let's just find a workaround or let's force companies and researchers to find other ways of doing this that might be suboptimal. Or, of course, the more conventional argument is it might just slow research down too much, or it might constrain the research and economic activities. Those are kind of two off the cuff ideas about any legislation that focuses on agentic frameworks or autonomy.
Yeah, and also maybe you should just kind of specify too, because if what they're asking for, and I don't know this bill super well, but if what they're asking for is just more data to be reported, I'm sort of in favor of it versus like, did you actually limit it in any way? And it seems like anytime we have more information reporting, especially if that can go into a public pool, the government doesn't have the same incentive to hide, especially cumulative data, But one more thing I was going to mention is that, like Riley Brown actually was talking about these marketplaces that are starting to spring up now, where agents can do on behalf of you spending of your money to
Yeah.
hire other humans to do things. And I don't know if you've ever read any of like the Daniel Suarez books, like Freedom TM or Damon, and they paint this world where agents that are autonomous, like just LLMs that represent you trying to get some goal accomplished, like build something. They go out and then they hire other humans to do pieces of it. And then those people say they built, like they might manufacture like a little piece of metal and then they ship it to some random address. And some other person can get this piece of metal and like add this thing to it and then ship it to this other address. And like we can lose track of what the agents are doing in the far future, you know, and they could be building stuff that are just like not comprehensible or we don't understand what it is. And that's kind of more of what I'm thinking that we should start worrying about in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
There
kind of
was
like
a conversation that I had. Go ahead. Go ahead, Olga.
yeah, it reminded me, I think it was Facebook where they a couple of years ago, I think this was where they kind of like unleashed two chatbots and they started talking to each other and
Nope,
they
we
just
might be
like
having some internet issues. Olga's breaking up and coming back in and out of signal. Yeah, no worries.
oh,
Please hold for technical difficulties. I'll leave that one line
Happens.
in the
well,
final.
Yeah.
all right. So it reminds me of a few years ago when Facebook unleashed like two chatbots and they started just talking to each other and created their own language. And so this is kind of where I think we should start getting concerned. That's why they had to like shut it down and start spewing out all this like racist and biased stuff. You know, I guess because it was trained on a bunch of like human data, and many people are racist and biased. So like, what can we expect from AI? You know, taking after us. Unfortunately, that's humanity in many instances. So I think this is where we need to certainly have regulations and we need to have oversight because otherwise we won't know what it is that we're dealing with, right? So I think some amount of regulation is necessary. And we have that in medicine too, right? Like sometimes it'll slow down research, but you can't go and experiment on people, you know, right away. There's steps that you need to take. You go with mice and then monkeys and then phase 1, phase 2, etc., right? And then you open it up to the public. Yes, sometimes things get slowed down, but it definitely protects like people, you know, ingesting like really harmful drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I guess as a society, we also have to, in the long run, determine like, do we want agents to be better than us or do we want them to reflect us? Because sometimes people are like, oh, that's not the same kind of freedom. But you might be saying, well, we're trying to build something here that's maybe a little bit more fair and equitable than like the history of human has been so far. So sometimes you have to think about what you do want to prune out of it. And those are
Yeah.
tough questions.
No,
Yeah.
I like that as like, okay, like what do you want to build? And you know, I think that some people actually may push back on me because now that I think about it, I think there are fewer people today that want to recreate humanity. I think that there's kind of general consensus that like, you know, human greed and anger and our attention mechanisms are flawed. And so we don't want to create us. We want to like give into our better angels when we build machines, when we build you know, these tools or these entities that could be our successors. I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with some folks in the earlier days before agent swarms and before agentic frameworks were being built, when we were trying to pioneer that space. And one of the guys, entrepreneur from France, he said, you know, I realized that these things are going to spend more time talking to each other than us. And that was like kind of a mind blown moment because now it's becoming more and more obvious, you know, like people are setting up all kinds of experiments like Claude talking to Chat GPT, and you can do that for fun. But to your point, Dylan, and like all these marketplaces where it's like, okay, what kinds of conversations are agents and models going to be having, to what purpose, like who's paying for it, how much oversight is happening. So rather than look at it from a regulatory perspective, I tend to look at it more from a technical perspective, because how much of it is noise, right? How do you know what to say? How do you know what not to say? Because when I was still working on like the ACE framework, one of the things that we very quickly discovered was that knowing when to shut up is actually more important, because it is so easy to create a noisy architecture where there's just too much superfluous information. And actually, like neurologically speaking, you have just as much neurons that are inhibitory neurons. So it's like you have brakes, right? You need gas and brakes and steering, but you actually have gatekeeping neurons in the brain that prevent the brain from getting too noisy, because otherwise you end up with a seizure, right? That's literally what like an epileptic seizure is the parts of the brain start talking too much. And so, but that's a little bit of background on kind of like thinking like, okay, what are the technical problems? But then also there's the, kind of the more aspirational, like, what is it that we want to build? And I think that there's probably not a lot of consensus on, what values to give these things or even what purpose to give them.
Yeah, I have
Well,
never
because
heard
we don't
anybody talk
know.
about trying to write languages that two would talk to each other over. But yeah, the fascinating idea that like, yeah, when two agents are talking to each other, we don't want them to speak like talk crap behind our back and like think about certain things. Like we want them to maybe be really efficient in the way they talk and very kind and maybe way more PC and like than you'd think because it represents us when we're not around. But yeah, anyways, go ahead, Olga.
What I think we can't figure out what values to give them because we all as humans have so many different values. We don't have as a species like one set of values. Maybe you have, things like, okay, we all should be kind, we should be, respectful. But even that, you'll have, plenty of cultures that deem, well, this person doesn't deserve respect, right? So why should I be respectful to them? Or this person doesn't deserve kindness. Why should I be kind to them? And this is where things will begin to get tricky, is that we as a society can't reach a consensus on what's important and what's not. So how can we expect AI to understand that?
Yeah. No, I mean, consensus around values, because I just, one of the groups that I talked to is the Meaning Alignment Institute, which actually talks about, instead of creating a knowledge graph, creating a moral graph, which is extracting all of the values from all people around the world. They haven't scaled up yet. I think their largest data set is about 1,000 people participated to extract those values. But then at least you have a map of values, and you say, okay, based on population and these issues, you can triangulate what people tend to converge on in terms of the underlying values and principles that people agree on. And one thing that was interesting from their research paper, and they do have a research paper out there. I have a episode on my main channel coming out soon where I'll be talking about that. But in their research paper, they were actually able to get pretty high degrees of consensus, even between diametrically opposed groups. So, like taking American Democrats and Republicans and asking them about abortion issues, rather than asking about like which way would you vote, it was asking about like what are the underlying sources of meaning, like what makes a meaningful decision in this debate. A very fascinating research. And I'm very optimistic that that kind of research can be integrated into artificial intelligence moving forward, so that at least it will have a map of all human values. And there was somewhere else that I was going with that, but I forgot. So I'll pass the ball to someone else.
Yeah, well, it just seems like, I mean, we're restricted by some things just from being born in the way that our hormones work and the way that natural, just human three-dimensional, like growing up is. And I guess there should be some map that we could teach AI systems so that they have some kind of boundaries around that. So it seems like an interesting project.
Yeah.
David, I'm curious, when you say like all around the world, what are we talking about, like both, like Western and Eastern cultures? And because so many times you'll have nations that have completely like opposite values, right? So what, like, do you know like what the study was, how deep and it went into the various cultures?
Yeah. So, and you do have a good point. So, one thing is to look at it from different levels. So, rather than clustering it like Eastern values or Western values or American values and German values or whatever, it's all values come from individuals. And so, an individual expresses their values, their sources of meaning, and their wisdom. And so, what you do is the way, and I haven't gone through the full process, so I might be misquoting exactly how it's done, but you using chatbots, you can interview people, say, okay, here's a situation. So there's a context, there's a story, and then there's a series of possible choices. And then you say, okay, given this set of possible choices, which choices are the wisest choices and why? And then you move to a new context. So that each node in the moral graph is a context or a state, a part of the story, and then each edge or each linkage is a choice, and some of the metadata attached to that branch is going to be the metadata about which choice do you think is wiser and why, and then you have a new state, and so then you can chart any context, any story, and then what happens is over time, as you aggregate this data from multiple people, you'll find that given the same context and the same set of choices, many people will make similar choices for similar reasons. And so it's not necessarily going to be like diametrically opposed values of like, collectivism versus individuality. Because when you get to the underlying sources of meaning, like what is it that people are paying attention to? Because this is one of the things that their tools extract, is not just like which choice would you make, but why? Like what are the underlying parts of it? Like, are you paying attention to, bodily autonomy as one, set of values, or something else, equality before the law, freedom of speech? But ultimately what happens is many people have very similar underlying values. Again, this research is new. They haven't done anything global yet, so it remains to be seen if it remains that consistent. Even so, you don't necessarily have to have convergence as long as you have a map saying, okay, like these people have these values, and these are the decisions that they would make, and this is why. And here's another group of people, and then from a larger like political systems perspective, you like whether you're an AI company or a government or whatever, you create a container that allows for everyone to live in alignment with their values in an ideal world.
Interesting. When you talk about like underlying values, it makes me think that we begin to learn about ourselves as humanity a lot. I imagine like in this research, people are probably thinking like maybe we all have similar underlying values, even though the surface values might appear to be opposite. So I think it's just really cool in general
Yep.
about, the new wave of AI is not only are we learning AI, but we're discovering more and more about ourselves.
Yep. It is
Yeah, I would
definitely a forcing function. Go ahead, Dylan.
Oh, I was just saying, like, I would love the opportunity to have a time machine and go back before, pre-written history. Like, if I could see what the world was like, say, 100,000 years ago, and just what kind of morality naturally occurred without written record. Like without books like the Bible, and like even historical things that have like shaped entire continents and countries of people. It'd be, I don't know. I would love, maybe AI can start shedding some light on what our like natural morality really is as it gets individual.
Well,
Decisions.
that's one of the hypotheses of a simulation hypothesis, is an ancestor simulation. So maybe we are in an ancestor simulation because someone in the far distant future to us wants to understand how we think today.
You mean like there could be millions of different Earths all simulated, and then each one would have like a variation of the Bible or something, and then they would watch how Western society changed, and then Eastern society, and they would be learning to see which one is best for them, and we're just one
Yeah.
of the billions. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
no, well, because there's two primary reasons to run a simulation. One is scientific curiosity, and two
Yeah.
is entertainment. So I would much rather live in the scientifically curious universe rather than the one that's just like some kid playing GTA 28 or whatever, you know?
Right. And his storyline's taking place somewhere else on Earth, and we're just so far removed from it, and we're just interacting as we should.
We're just NPCs in the background
Yeah,
simulation of some,
maybe,
yeah.
maybe.
You
So
never know.
that's one set of possibilities. Yep. So let's move over to OpenAI. So OpenAI and Sam Altman have had quite a week. So I think to me the biggest piece is that Scarlett Johansson is suing OpenAI for their AI voice that sounds a lot like her from the movie Her. 2014. It was her. It was Scarlett Johansson and what was the other actor? Gosh, I can't remember his name
That
right now.
guy,
Yeah,
got his
yeah.
name too.
What-
But
Joaquin
those
Phoenix.
are-
That's it.
yeah.
Yep. So ScarJo is suing them because during their big GPT-4 demonstration, they demonstrated this very flirty, kind of breathy female chatbot that sounded very similar to Scarlett Johansson in that movie 10 years ago. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg, though. They've also had a bunch of resignations. So there was Leah Sutskever, Jan Leka, and then I think at least 3 other resignations in the last couple of days over various issues. One of the most recent ones, she said pretty much she had the same concerns as Leah and Jan. And so it's like, okay, well, something serious is going on here. And then the last thing that was mentioned just before we started recording was the non-disparagement clawback of shares. So I think Olga, you wanted to cover some of that. Do you want to talk about the clawback thing that was kind of leaked by, I think you said it by Vox, right?
Yeah, it was Vox. So they got a whole bunch of like leaked documents and emails proving that OpenAI had been asking employees who either resigned, and I think thereafter even employees who they fired, that they need to sign non-disparagement clauses and confidentiality clauses that appear to be very, very strict, far beyond what is the standard of confidentiality, what we see today in any company, really. And employees who would refuse, they would be losing all of their equity. And that could be millions of dollars, depending on how much equity you have, right? So, some employees, they pushed back, and then OpenAI kind of changed their legal strategy a little bit. And then eventually the information was leaked to Vox. And now, once they already kind of have this, cat let out of the bag, Sam Altman said, well, this should have never been in the documents. Like, I should have known about this, but I didn't really know about this. But his signature is like all over these documents. So we don't know exactly, obviously, what's going on, what they're doing. But what we do know is that they are dead set on creating AGI. Like, they talk about this openly all the time. What does AGI look like, right? Clearly, there's some issues on what what safety measures are in place, and how far do we actually want to go with technology? There's plenty of black boxes. How much of a black box is it? And it seems like maybe some employees did have this knowledge, and OpenAI just didn't want anything leaking out. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I saw, because for those who haven't seen, Sam Altman had a tweet where he said like, oh, like he literally said like the quiet part out loud, like he said like the words, it's super embarrassing, I should have known this. And it's like, I don't know, to me it just really, it doesn't pass the sniff test, because it's like, okay, you're just saying the thing that someone would say, like, you don't actually regret this, you regret that it was leaked. It's kind of how it felt to me. And then the same thing is, I just pulled it up, he has a tweet from, what was it, from 10 days ago, so May 13th, where the tweet is literally just her, 21 million views. And so, but then there was like, we didn't actually copy Scarlett Johansson's voice. And so it's like, I don't know, it seems like he's kind of shooting himself in the foot repeatedly on Twitter. He's not doing the best. Yeah, go ahead.
He offered pay her to use her voice, and she refused.
Right.
And then he, sent her another letter saying like, hey, I really hope you reconsider. And she still refused. And then they went ahead and did it. And the reason that they were able to do it is because there is no law in place on being able to copyright your own voice. I know, because I actually looked into it like a year ago when it became so easy to clone your voice, and I started thinking like, oh, well, maybe I don't want someone pretending to me and it being like very plausible. There's a bunch of cases where people were receiving phone calls that sounded like their loved ones, and they were saying, oh, well, I got kidnapped. And of course, like, a person panics, a mother gets a phone call from her child that she is kidnapped and they're going to hurt her. Of course, they're going to run and try to get whatever money and whatever is necessary. And it turns out like these were just fakes. There's no law. There's absolutely no law in place to regulate that. And that's why OpenAI was able to do it.
Yeah. Now there are copyright laws about using someone's likenesses, because like, there have been plenty of actors that have signed away like their likeness, and so, but that is a more conventional approach. So some of this has yet to be litigated. Will it go up to the Supreme Court? Who knows? But and so there's also, so I guess from what I know, and I'm not of course a legal expert, but there's probably a First Amendment case to be made of fair use. But then there's also the copyright, which is like, okay, do you own your own likeness and stuff? And this is something that like has been pointed out to me, because you can use AI generators to make characters that look like famous actors and actresses. Now, I think that if you do it without profit as a motive, that probably falls under fair use, if I had to guess. But if you're selling a service, which OpenAI is, and you're profiting on something that is very clearly modeled on Scarlett Johansson's performance in a movie, then it's like, okay, that's a pretty steep case to make. But you're right that there's not established case law, particularly with this technology. Yeah.
I'll throw in a couple of things. So one, when you're mimicking like a regular person's voice who's not famous, and you're using it, especially for nefarious means, like trying to take money from your grandparents or something by pretending, it's pretty like open shut. But as you go down that chain and you become more like playful or abstracted, and what you're doing with the voice doesn't impact that person's life in a way where it messes with their sense of self. So if you take a joke like a parody, right, and if it's very clear that it's a parody and it's not Donald Trump, then it's a little bit of a different scene. So there's like, are you famous? That like makes it a little bit harder to like protect your name. And then there's like, are you using it with the intention that someone else might actually think that really is them? And that, so with the Scarlett Johansson thing, I was kind of like, I kind of thought it was more of a nothing burger because I chose Sky. That was my favorite voice. And probably subtly, it's because I love the movie Her or something, but I never once remember using it thinking, this is Scarlett Johansson. It was never marketed as like her or Scarlett Johansson's voice. So to me, it was in kind of theme of that movie, maybe, but not necessarily her. But I guess if there were really thousands of people that thought that was her and it said rude things and now they're not going to see her movie or something, then they'll
Yeah.
definitely have a case. But it kind of depends on where it lands.
Yeah. No, so yeah, because thinking about it, there's a few there. Like, so one is there a financial loss? You could make an argument that like that, especially because there's a chain of events where Sam Altman expressed intent saying, "I want your voice to do this. I want your performance,"
Yeah, that's
and
true.
then she said no. So that's like, okay, so you just ignored her and did it anyways. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking from the perspective of like a civil jury or a civil courtroom, the judge will be like, okay, so she told you no, and you ignored that and did it anyways. You owe her money, right? Or she
Yeah.
can sue you for damages and loss because there is like what. Granted, I know that civil like the burden is different than criminal, and I think that's probably. I don't think there's necessarily a criminal case here because, like Dylan, to your point, you can if it's a parody or commentary or whatever, there's lots and lots of established case law about fair use for those kinds of things. But in this case, I think it primarily comes down to commercial use, which it's like, okay, there's a series of events that establish intent, and then he just ignored her wishes anyways. So I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe we'll end up in some weird world where like your personal LLM can like sound just like one of these celebrities if it's joking, but then it will be smart enough to like turn it off if it's like not a parody or something. So who knows?
Yeah.
I think she's gonna. It would
So
need to be.
yeah, no, good stuff. Go ahead, Olga.
I think typically in law you need to have standing, so you would need to show some kind of loss or like severe like damages in order for it to go to actually yield any kind of result for you. You're gonna have a really hard time if you just say like I didn't want them to do this, or they did something wrong. Then you need to show like actual damages. And so I don't know how much standing there is, but if she can show that it, like Dylan said, right, like, well, now nobody's going to see her movie or something, right, and she blatantly refused, then maybe it's more likely. Otherwise, I don't know how realistic.
Yeah. Time will tell. And, as Sam Altman has said before, they get sued all the time for various reasons and purposes. Still, it's bad optics. And that's kind of one of my things is like, it just doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good. It's like, these are supposed to be the guys that say, we're going to make sure that AGI benefits humanity, but they can't respect the dignity of a famous actress. Like, to me, that's the kind of slimy part.
You know what? That's my problem with Sam Altman, like across the board, is like this guy really feels like a product guy. I mean, maybe even going back to like Leah and everybody from the safety alignment team, it seems like he believes in AGI, but he's always been that Y Combinator startup, like move quick, agile product builder. And AGI just requires, in my opinion, such a much more slow, like cumulative approach. Like it's not move fast and break things. It's like the most dangerous thing we're ever going to develop in the history of humanity. Like somebody like Demis Hassabis seemed like he was more concerned with doing it right. You know what I mean? So yeah, that product, having a lead like with product is great for Microsoft's bottom line, but it just doesn't feel like the right person to be running.
Yeah,
like a big project like this that might be first to AGI.
Totally agree. So yeah, we'll stay tuned to what comes out of that space. Dylan, there's a couple of ideas that you wanted to get to before we close out. So, do you want to introduce the kind of the papers you were talking about?
I'll just jump to this one idea that had like consumed me all weekend, which was there is this thought that is starting to resonate with me that I definitely wanted to kind of get both of your takes on, which is that the idea of consciousness, this human consciousness that we have, which seems like, oh, it only happens in higher level species, and it only seems like it's the most like the highest form of consciousness, right? Like you get more conscious basically as you get smarter. You put fish and dogs and gerbils and humans on this scale, and it's this sliding scale of more alive, more like understanding of yourself in the world. You're more of this entity that needs to be kind of like respected in the grand scheme of the universe. But under a certain light of ignorance, it also makes sense. And I'll explain. When the first time you sat down and learned how to drive a car, do you remember how conscious and present you were of like where your hands were and where your foot was on the gas pedal? And, you know, you might have had an instructor or a parent sitting next to you, and like the world was so all about living in that moment, because you're like, I could hurt someone with this car. I want to pass my driving test. And then as weeks and weeks went on and months and years, now you get in your car and you drive without any thought, right? It has become sort of from conscious to unconscious. And what maybe this thought of like what it is that we are, like what it is to be ultra conscious, is actually like a circle that's growing. And the edge of the circle, the perimeter of the circle, is where you bump up against ignorance. So you become smart enough to then constantly be aware of all the things you don't know. And like maybe that's a better view. It's almost like we can achieve more ignorance as we get smarter. And that's the way to think about consciousness, which is different, because if you start scaling, we have a human brain that has like hits up against the skull. There's only so much room in there. But as you keep just building these things in parallel, these giant AI systems, they might not become conscious in the same way, because they keep assimilating the information so quickly and putting it into what we would call like our default mode, or something that's more subconscious. So they don't ever seem like they're conscious, even as they get smarter and smarter. And maybe humans wouldn't either. Maybe consciousness is part of the limitation of our brain. And if we actually could just plug into Neuralink, we might actually become less conscious, because we would have all of this information from other people kind of instinctively understood. But I don't know, there's something there that like, I can't put 100% words on it, but there's something there I'd love to just hear what you think about.
Yeah, I mean, a couple ideas spring to my mind immediately. So one is kind of the importance of negative space, you know, because there's the content of what is known, and then there's what is unknown. I'm actually reading a book. It's Why We Sleep, and one of the things that he said was kind of reversing. Instead of asking why do we sleep, you just flip the question, why are we awake? Because one of his assertions is that maybe the default state of life is to be asleep, and so then he abandoned. But I was so frustrated, because I was like, this is such a great idea, and then he abandons it like a page later to talk about like, oh, we have no way of predicting how much animals are going to sleep. And I was like, you just said how to predict it. You don't measure how much sleep do you need. You assume that you need infinite amount of sleep. Then you ask the question, how much awakefulness do you need in order to survive? And I think that if you look at animals, because like, what is it, like cats only, like they're awake 6 hours a day because they only need to be, they're predators. Humans, however, like there's an argument to be made that we're awake more than our primate relatives, because we're terrestrial, we're on the ground. We can't sleep up in trees where it's much safer. So we're awake longer because we have to be awake longer. And he looks at that from the perspective of from like dolphins and other animals, even like lizards and such. So I like the idea of just flipping the script, just for a sake of argument. Like, what if consciousness, to your point, is like more about what you don't know or what you're not aware of? Now, what I will say is this is more of a functionalist or epistemic look at consciousness rather than a phenomenological look at consciousness. Like, what is the subjective sense of being? So another like point, or maybe another way of looking at it that I was thinking about earlier, is, you know, people say like, oh, well, AI doesn't truly understand. It's just a, you know, mathematical representation, you know, stochastic parrot or whatever. And I say, well, but like, why does a human understand? The humans, we have a signal in our brain that tells us that we think we understand, but we're often wrong. And so it's like we have the subjective experience of like something in your brain says, I know what I'm talking about. But man, lots of people don't know what they're talking about, even though they think that they do. And so like, what's the difference between a machine that thinks it knows what it's talking about and a human that thinks they know what they're talking about? So I really appreciate just looking at the whole thing from the perspective of ignorance.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, well,
ignorance
it
is
just occurred to
bliss,
me that maybe the
right?
machines don't wake up, you know?
Yeah, I think, there's a
Go ahead, Olga.
reason why you have the saying ignorance is bliss. Because if you're constantly thinking about everything, and you know everything, and you know that there is, constant dangers, and anything can happen to you all at once at the same time, you're never going to leave your house. You're going to be miserable all the time. Like people who watch news nonstop are always unhappy. They're more scared. They take less risks. They're less likely to actually have that kind of feeling of happiness because they're constantly thinking about the negative. And so I think from this perspective, we do need a certain amount of ignorance in order to function, in order to be happy, in order to accept the present moment. Otherwise, you're just thinking all the time, and like that's not good. That's not fun. That's not.
Yeah. That reminds me of a book that I read in service to trying to work on cognitive architecture called The Forgetting Machine. Have you guys read that one or heard of that book?
Mm-mm.
No.
So The Forgetting Machine is it's a book about kind of how much information the brain doesn't actually use and how low bandwidth the brain actually is, because the
Oh.
total amount of IO from the human brain is like 1 kilobit a second, grand total. So it goes through and just like says, here's how much information your brain is taking in from the outside world. Here's how much information it's putting back out. Super, super low bandwidth. And so it's like, okay, you could fit what you see, what you think you see, in like a 20 kilobit image, right? Like our entire like hallucination of reality is extremely low resource, but we think that it's high resource or high resolution because it's reconstructed inside of our own heads. And then of course there's so much that there's like your brain very deliberately discards a lot of information. Anything that is seen as superfluous, anything that is familiar.
Mhm.
So like I think Dylan, last time you were talking about like if like what was it, like if you move a doorknob like 2 inches, you'll notice
Mm-hmm.
it the first time, but then you'll forget about it because your brain is constantly economizing on like how much information can you get away with ignoring most of the time. And so like that's one of the key functions of our brain. And then also part of like dreaming is compressing memories. And so like one thing that I realized before I went on my trip to Austin was that I have an archetypal like set of perfect days in my life. And so like for me, it feels like one day, but like it was when I was little, my dad would always take me to the river. And so all of those memories, they're very similar. They happen in the same location. For me, it's like more or less one day, but I know it was many, many, many days that have all been compressed into one archetypal, like perfect childhood day.
So
Um,
do
Go
you
ahead.
think dreaming is a compression system, and that when you imagine yourself, it's an upscaler?
Oh, absolutely. It's that was actually the inspiration for what I call the sparse priming representation, which is
Hmm.
recognizing, because I read that book, The Forgetting Machine, and just realized how sparse human memory and human intelligence is. We reconstitute pretty much everything we know on the fly. And so that's like the latent space of an AI model, same exact principle as the latent space of a human brain, because at any given moment, your brain has a whole bunch of dormant pathways and circuits that are not being used, whether it's for memory or problem solving or whatever. And actually, in working on all that stuff, I realized that memory and problem solving are the same cognitive behavior. Like you're just reconstituting information in a different format. So yeah, that's a one way of looking at the
But
whole thing.
do you think you're upscaling a tiny little fact of truth, or do you think you're upscaling something that's fake or is similar? Is it recreating something similar to what actually happened, and then you upscale that?
It's a little bit of both, and probably a couple of other things happening from an informational perspective. So one, there's what's called like pointers. So this comes from computer science, where you can have memory registers where it's like, okay, and this is actually used in compression algorithms where it's like, here's one file, and rather than repeating that file 5 million times, you just have a bunch of pointers pointing at the same file. So part of what
Mhm.
happens during dreaming and memory compression and consolidation is you say, okay, let's just kind of generalize all the aspects of thing X that we're familiar with. And it'll be lossy because you're going to exclude, some of the finer details, finer grain details that are not necessarily relevant like I know what the river looks like. I know what, my coffee mug looks like. And so that becomes a compressed artifact in your brain. And so then every time I think about this particular mug, right, it's every pointer is pointing back at the same thing. So the archetype in the brain is lossy because it's compressed, and then you have a bunch of pointers pointing at the same thing, that's one of the reasons that I think that you can have category errors, and why we can actually really quickly correct that cognitive bias, because it's like if your brain grabs the wrong pointer and you're like, oh, I thought you were talking about something else, but then our brain clearly has the ability to switch tracks very quickly. when you recognize that you've made a category error. But again, it's lossy by design, in part for speed, because just how quickly you can recall stuff into your brain. Because out on the, in forests and savannas and whatever, out on the ocean on a canoe, speed is of the essence. So, like, again, that's our brain excludes a tremendous amount of information on purpose for the sake of speed and survival.
Yeah, absolutely. You need that level of like heuristics in a way. You can't like stand there and analyze constantly. Is it a snake or is it a twig? Right? Because by that time the snake has bit you and you're dead.
Yep. Yeah. And like if it bites you, then you'll know quicker, but it's better to just not get bitten in the first place.
Right. Because how much danger is it for you to jump away from a stick versus the converse of not jumping away from a snake? It's I think constantly we're calculating at risk reward, and sometimes we're wrong, but we need to have that cognitive processes constantly happening.
Yep. And there's another hypothesis. I can't remember what it's called, but basically I watched a great video about it, unpacking it about a year or two ago. That was basically saying like everything that your brain gives you, like in your conscious experience, is titrated based on optimizing for survival. Now, I don't fully agree with this hypothesis because your brain is not able to always predict heuristically what is and is not relevant, what is not germane from the real world. But it is an interesting thought experiment to say, okay, maybe the entire hallucination of reality that your brain is giving you is titrated based on strictly through a survival lens. If the information and the beliefs that you end up cultivating are only germane to survival, then that's all you're going to have in your brain. I don't fully agree with that interpretation because, again, our brains we have a tremendous amount of abstract ways of understanding the world, which is itself survivability. Because the more abstract you understand, for instance, the weather, the more you can survive, storms and climate change and whatever else is going on. But it's still an interesting way of thinking about, like, okay, what is the difference between the outside world and the inside world?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the outside world is
fascinating
shared
conversation.
experience, right? Like the inside world, only
What was that,
you're the
Olga?
one. The inside world, you're the only one experiencing it.
Yep.
The outside world is shared experience.
Yep.
So that's the main difference.
Mhm.
Now, maybe for let's say like people who are schizophrenic, right? Like there's no difference. So for them, the inside world is all that really matters, and they have like no concept that the outside world doesn't share that experience. So it's clear that if that's all you have, like there is something that is neurologically wrong inside your system. And we need that shared experiences because like people we're social creatures, right? So we need other people. Like no man is an island entire of itself, right? So this is where the main difference is. And I think, just to bring it back to AI for a second, AI only has that, like, at least as of now, right, doesn't have shared experiences across all users that are interacting with it. It only has that one experience that it will forget as soon as the user disconnects it or deletes it. But that's where I think the difference begins to emerge, is when it will know everything that it has across all possible conversations with all interactions with all humans. Then we might begin to see an emergence of consciousness.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a quotation by Albert Einstein, which I think will be a great place to wind up, which is reality is merely an illusion, albeit a persistent one. So we'll call it a day there. And thanks, guys, for jumping in. I will look forward to how some of these things play out. Take care, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and watching.
Thank you.
As always, this hour has flown by.
Always.
All right. Thanks, David. Thanks, Dylan.
Okay, we'll see.